Yes, so where were we? We were talking about myself. Yeah, so I'm Charlotte Howard. I'm a garden designer and horticultural consultant. I live in Wiltshire, just near Bath, and I've been gardening now for 17 years, but obviously as a hobby, like most of you, for most of my life until I could hold a trowel. On a mad whim, about 4 years ago, I decided to do a master's degree, God knows why. I wanted to I'd probably expand my knowledge, and I'd never had a degree, and that was sort of why I decided to do so. Um, Obviously, as part of a master's degree, you have to choose your dissertation, and I always knew I wanted to do something about biodiversity. I live in the country. I'm very lucky to live in the country. And I know as a gardener, we have a responsibility to look after the land around us. And so um, something about greening up cities, because whenever I go to cities, I find them hot and sticky and claustrophobic. And when I go to London, I feel like I need to go to Regent's Park to breathe. So when I was in hot and sticky London, I came across this amazing living wall. I don't know if any of you know this. It's in London. It's the Elephant and Castle. I've since found out it's by a company called Biotecture, and it's quite a famous landmark in the Elephant and Castle roundabout. And I was just really intrigued about it, and I thought that was what I wanted to do. I've since found out that obviously living walls can be outdoors and indoors. I have an obsession with houseplants, as you can probably see, and I don't know if you're the same as me. So I have a bit of a speciality of houseplants as well as outdoor plants, and I've created lots of indoor gardens. This is one of the indoor gardens I created for an Indian restaurant in my local town of Corsham. This garden was inspired by a man called James Wong. I don't know if you all listen to Gardener's Question Time. He's one of my favourites because he's quite no nonsense about gardening. And he talks about Singapore, his hometown, and how it's a garden city. So apparently, one of the things he said, for every square metre of concrete, they have to match it up with a square metre of greenery. I'm not sure the exact figures, but that's what it is. And Singapore in particular, the gardens, the buildings actually burst with greenery. I mean, they look amazing. So he and that wall were kind of my inspiration to talk about living walls. When I started doing research, I found out about other designers. There's a very famous French designer called Patrick Blanc, who I'll touch on later, and lots of other innovative installers, Scottscape, ANS Global, Biotecture, and Mobilane, who again I'll touch on. And they all have their very own different ways of growing the plants. And of course, everything's patented, and everyone's module system is the best one ever. So my dissertation was going to find out which were the best systems. So what is a green wall? It can be all sorts of things. Basically, it's a self-sufficient vertical garden that is attached to the exterior of a building. They can also be called green facades, but green facades are quite different to living walls. So this picture here that you can see is what's called a green facade. The plants are planted in the ground, and they're attached to a vertical system which is attached to the walls. So the plants get their nutrients and their water from the ground. The way living walls are different is the plants get their nutrients and their water from the wall itself. Basically, they're planted into the structure, so the vertical support. So that's what's different. So they're sort of basically free hanging plants. They can also be called vertical gardens, or they can be called green walls. But green walls I tend to associate with horrible plastic plants, and we don't like those, do we? Living walls, although you may think are sort of a new trendy buzzword, they're not actually as modern as you think. They've actually been going for millennia. From Western civilization, farmers have been utilizing their space as much as possible. To make the best of their small amount of lands, you would be given a small amount of common land, and you had to make the most of your space. So you look around, you see vineyards and terraces and old medieval ridges on hills. Those would be south-facing terraces that they would grow vines on, or vegetables, or whatever. And fascinatingly, when I was doing my research, I've always known that there were ridges in Glastonbury Tor, and I didn't really realise, but apparently these are what's called medieval field terraces, or lynchets. I don't know if you've ever discussed lynchets. So the idea of a lynchet is that you have a flat piece of soil, that's how much you can grow on it. But if you actually make it like that, you can extend your growing medium by twice. It's a bit like permaculture now. In the Middle East, of course, the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, vertical gardens began to be grown for pleasure. Of course, the most famous one is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Within these gardens of pleasure, they would be in courtyards, and the idea of them would be to provide shade and coolness, and they would be wonderful, cool sanctuaries away from the heat of the city or the desert or whatever. And these would be plants just hanging on every square inch of these courtyards. They would make use of it, and there would be water would be part of it. But of course, people got their inspiration from the wild. So lots of species of plants actually grow happily on vertical surfaces. They're called epiphytes. So anything that grows on another thing is called an epiphyte. I don't know if any of you have got Phalaenopsis orchids, bee orchids. Those are epiphytes, and the reason why they're in clear containers is because they normally grow on branches, and the roots like to have sunlight, so that's why they're in clear pots. So whenever your orchids are resting, always take them out of the pots. That's my little hint for you there. In the UK, we have our own varieties of epiphytes. I'll just show you a picture. Here are some epiphytes growing in a jungle, but we have our own. They're called mosses, ferns, liverworts, lichens, algae and microfungi also. But so that's the past and that's the wild. Now to the modern living wall innovations. So the inventor of living walls is this fella here. He's called Stanley Hart White. He was a professor of landscape architecture at the University of Illinois. He studied there or taught there from 1922 until 1959. He was an incredibly inspirational teacher. If you look him up, you'll see so many landscape architects have been taught by him or inspired by him, and his chalk drawings on the blackboards were particularly beautiful. And he was a bit of a, in his spare time, he would fiddle around with various inventions, and this is one of his inventions. He called them botanical bricks, and he would develop prototypes in his back garden in Urbana in Illinois. He had quite a famous brother. His brother was E.B. White. I don't know if you know the name, but E.B. White was a writer of Stuart Little and Charlotte's Web. So there we go. E.B. White documented the first documentation of this invention was in 1937. And E.B. White talks to his wife about his mad brother and his botanical bricks. Here's a quote from his letter, where he talks about these botanical bricks, simply plant units capable of being built up to any height for quick landscape effects. These vertical surfaces covered with flowering vines or the like. He thinks the idea has great possibilities for fairs, city yards, indoor gardens, and many other projects. So even back in 1937, with his mad brother, he realized what a potential this invention would have. Over the rest of the year, following year from the letter being written, he started to refine his invention, and he brought out this patent here. So this is one of the pages from his patent. It's called a vegetation bearing architectonic structure and system. Bit of a mouthful. And that was his field of vegetation bearing architecture, basically, is what he called it. Unfortunately, this patent was lost for many years, until fairly recently, and then it was discovered by the Graham Foundation, and they have a research award, and in 2012 2013 some students actually rebuilt the patent, and these are the so-called botanical bricks. You can see they literally are bricks. Within those bricks, it looks like they've got some sort of rock wall or some sort of hydroponic growing medium in there, which is quite interesting. I love all the pipes, the steampunk pipes at the back. And then here is a computer rendering of what they were going to create, and it won an award. I think this invention, the impact of it is still to be unrealized. So many people don't know that this man invented it. There is somebody who's more famous for living walls, who I'll talk about in the next slide. But I think Stanley Hart White really modernized gardening, and he brought gardening into the public sphere in no other way, in a completely different way. But probably the most famous living wall exponent is this mad guy. He's called Patrick Blanc. He's French, a botanist. famous for his green hair and his tropical shirts. And if you look carefully, you can see he's got the most enormous long green talons. Apparently he uses those talons for pricking out plants and shoving them in. So there we are. I've got my talons at the moment from a wedding, so I'm going to have a go with those. Born in 1953, he spent 40 years of his life researching plants. He went out into the tropical rainforests and saw them growing vertically and wondered if he could bring that system back. He experimented with his parents' aquarium, and then he managed to build his first wall in Paris, the Paris suburbs, in 1991. But that wasn't a particularly known one. He didn't actually create international fame until he built a wall at a French garden show, unlike anything that we have in this country. I mean, it was completely bonkers. It's in 1994, and it was called the International Festival of Gardens and Landscapes. It's at the Chateau of Chaumont-sur-Loire, and it's completely bonkers. If you look Google images, you see these amazing sculptures, and yeah, they really look out of place to what we do. And this was the first of its kind. Here he is. This is his patent. I'll talk about his patent in a second. Here he is with his wall, much younger. The wall is still going. It's taken on a life of its own. Here it is, massive now. So his patent basically is quite different to Stanley Hart-White's. The big thing about it is that there's a particular kind of felt. So on the back is a waterproof membrane, and then 2 to 3 layers of this magic permeable cloth. He called it his irrigation cloth. It's not woven, it's compressed together, so what that means, it doesn't sag over time, and the pockets of air don't expand when it's frozen. The felt is basically supposed to emulate the moss that the epiphytes would grow in. Now, when the felt is put up, then he cuts little holes in it and pushes the plants through with his fingernails. And then he has those staples at the back, which are purely temporary, because eventually what happens is the plants then grow through the back of the felt, and then all these little roots start clinging onto the felt and clinging into each other. So they don't actually need a system or any soil to grow in. So it is basically what's called a hydroponic system, which I'm sure you are aware of. So we'll just go through to the next slide. He has only done 4 walls in this country. This is his most famous wall. It's the Athenaeum Hotel in Mayfair. It's 10 stories high, and it's designed to emulate the Green Park opposite. And it's supposedly a haven for biodiversity, according to the Athenaeum website. So certainly well worth a visit if you go to London. There are lots of other installers. There's about 200 currently in the world. Here are some of the most famous ones, and these are the people that helped me with my dissertation, so I always want to give them a bit of a shout out. Biotecture do big, snazzy high-rise office blocks, but they also have a company called Plant Box, and they're a bit more domestic. So if you wanted to grow your own living wall, certainly Plant Box is one of the ones I'd recommend. Not that I'm giving any money, but that's quite a good one. Scottscape in the middle, who created the wall in the picture, they have a hydroponic hybrid system, which is similar to Patrick Blanc's, but it's felt pockets, but it has soil as well. So everything is sort of covered in that way. So those are the installers. But the old question of the whole thing is, are they all cracked up to be? What is good about living walls? Well, they have many benefits. This is a sort of thing I've been thinking about recently. Since lockdown, I think we've all realised how lucky we are to have gardens. Those of us that have gardens, whether it be a window box or a huge 5-acre estate. I for one have been incredibly grateful. I have had friends that have been shielding in 3rd floor 1-bedroom flats and haven't been able to get out, and I realise how lucky I am. So the RHS did this survey, and they came up with all of these different statistics about how much people have really valued their gardens. And I don't know if any of you are professional gardeners, but I have never been busier since lockdown, so I'm very, very grateful. People have said it's helped with their mental health, so that's another very interesting survey that was done during the summer. People were given a plant and a shrub and a tree to look after, and apparently their mental health increased greatly, and they've had a purpose in life. And because their mental health was good, their physical health improved. But unfortunately, not many people are lucky enough to have a garden. So this is where living walls come in, because they can grow in a space where you wouldn't be able to even have a container. So I like to look at this picture and imagine this lady's got her fifth floor flat, and she's got rid of her telly, and she's got a living wall growing there instead, stroking her leaves for fun. So this is that's basically a bit more about greenery and living walls. So we all need plants, not just for eating, but for making us feel better. We're all nature, and I think people don't realize that we are part of nature. We are part of its vast ecosystem, yet we spend our lives, as a gardener, I find it an anathema that we spend our lives mowing stripes into it and cutting it into balls and tying it to walls, rather than kind of just letting it do its thing. I've found, since I've been more relaxed about my gardening style, I've been a happier person than, you know, let the weeds come, you know, don't mow the lawn once a week. And, you know, I found that I've got much more biodiversity in my garden as a result. The love of plants that we have actually has a name. It's called biophilia. Interior design is called biophilic design. Basically, that's a Ponzi name for putting houseplants in your room. And it was a term that was coined by a man called Edward O. Wilson in 1984, and he calls it the human's innate affinity with nature through their love of living things. So we love living things. We need to see green. A lack of greenery has been studied. Many urban areas have had studies taken of them without greenery, and they found that there's been deprivation, which of course then leads to lack of education and crime and drug taking and vandalism and all sorts of things. And also their mental health feelings. So you know, where would you feel more comfortable? Would you prefer to have your lunch hour in a busy street, or would you prefer to walk a bit further and find a park? You feel less isolated with green space around you, less stressed, and areas filled with plants have also been proven to reduce antisocial behaviour. One garden I went to visit as part of my dissertation was one by ANS Global, and it was London City Walls, a huge site, massive site, and I asked him if there'd been any vandalism, because it's in quite a rough area, and he said not a single leaf had been pulled out, which is an amazing show how people respect greenery. Of course, if you, like I said before, if you feel good mentally, you feel good physically, you're more likely to go out and exercise. It improves your lungs, all of these things. Apparently, they did a study on people in workplaces, and they found that if they had greenery around them, that they worked harder. There's also a German study about people in hospitals, and apparently they did two studies, somebody without greenery to look at and people with greenery to look at, and those with greenery to look at required less pills. And oh, I have unlimited minutes apparently, which is good. They obviously loved my talk. Work more efficient. People in hospitals, they asked for less drugs, and they were checked out quicker from hospitals. They got better quicker. So, and that's an actual study. So if anyone wants to know, I can certainly provide you with that. It's a very dry read. They improve air quality. We spend 22 hours of our lives, well, I didn't used to when I was a gardener, but I do more now, I'm a designer, but 22 hours of our lives at least inside. And sometimes some interiors are more polluted than the exteriors. And pollution can be all sorts of things. It can be dust, it can be pollen, it can be all sorts of things. Nitrogen dioxide obviously is the big polluter we know all about from fossil fuels. Between 28,000 and 36,000 premature deaths are due to pollution, which is quite shocking. But as well as nitrogen dioxide, there's even finer particles, which can be found in all sorts of places, like dust, like mold, etc. And these fine particles, called PM10s, PM1s, whatever they're called, can actually enter your bloodstream. So it's quite concerning. But fear not. The University of Lancaster did a study, and they found that various plants can actually absorb these really dangerous fine particles of dust, and they actually take them into their leaves and into their tissue and down into the ground, which then releases this space for clean air. If they planted a living wall with these particular plants that were very good at clearing pollution, they found that it reduced the nitrogen dioxide by 40% and the tiny particles by 60%. So that's a really amazing thing. So they basically breathe air into cities, they purify the air in your interiors, and they lead to a sort of happier staff and improved working conditions. And look how happy that lady is with her living wall behind her. So there we are. Insulation. They keep buildings cool in the summer and warm in the winter. In the summer, basically through what's called evapotranspiration, the moisture that comes out of plants, that means that you don't have to have so much air conditioning. In the winter, they have a sort of air block is created between the wall and the plant, which then acts as another insulator. So they found that a living wall, this pillow of air created by the living wall between the plant and the wall, reduces the wind chill by 75%, which means that you don't have to heat the building by, it's basically reduced your need to heat a building by 25%. This was a study that was done by another university. They have lots of thermal benefits, which are basic. There's a big study going on with the University of Sheffield, and they found irrefutable proof, but the study is still ongoing, and I have yet to find out about if the paper's been published and peer reviewed yet. When that comes out, that's going to be quite exciting to prove how good living walls are. And further proof, when I was doing a little bit of research for my dissertation, I find this guy called Gary Grant. He's a green infrastructure consultant, and he took this thermal image of two buildings side by side. On the left is one without a living wall, on the right is one with a living wall, and you can see the heat coming off the stone in that one and those big windows. It must be like an oven in there. But on the right, how much cooler that building is. This was obviously taken in June, so I assume it would be a similar good effect the other way around in the winter. Biodiversity obviously is a big buzzword at the moment, or wildlife friendly. Some buildings have been they're built and they're taking over places that might have been green fields, so at least you can right the wrongs by putting a living wall. So my dissertation was about this particular factory that was built in Swindon, and we were trying to work out if we put a living wall on the factory, would it mitigate the destruction to the wildlife. And it certainly can. I don't know completely, but certainly to a great deal. Lots of the living wall people put living nesting boxes and birds nest, and these pictures from ANS Global, and they've even had birds nesting in them, which is amazing. But when choosing your living wall, you must plant it up like you would your own garden. So make sure that you have a wide variety of different plants. As you can see in the picture on the bottom left, there's about 5 different leaf types in there that you can imagine. So it's basic, just like your garden, but just that way. As well as being great for wildlife, they look quite cool. They are seen as living, breathing sculptures. Hotels, trendy offices, people like that love them. It's great for the image of a company, to say that we're forward thinking, we're thinking about greenery. It looks good. They're nice things to have around. I mean, you can see this is probably a rather ugly roof terrace. They've covered some boring bricks with this amazing sculpture. Malaysia has done studies into it and said, well, that it is basically public art. And you can create patterns with all the planting, and they're also quite flexible. So they come in small modules, so you can cut the modules to fit any shape. They can be curved, they can be slanted, wherever you want to have them, which is quite interesting. There are also different ways of you can have them lit up. I'm not sure if this is any of my personal taste, but this is this is a building at Covent Garden designed by Biotecture, all wrapped up for Christmas. But they do have some amazing lighting effects, and I do love greenery with lighting, although nowadays I'm sort of moving away from lighting gardens again, because they're not particularly great for nighttime birds and insects. Then they're not just walls. So Scottscape have invented this amazing thing called a living pillar. So this is Ebury Street in London. It's a trial. They started last summer. I haven't checked up actually to see how it's getting on, but I know it was doing very well last autumn. The idea being that you can't plant trees in Ebury Street, and they wanted to make use of the original street furniture. So basically they've stuck living walls on pillars. They've patented it and trademarked it, so this is their own thing, but they're all they basically look after themselves. So the irrigation system is powered by solar, You can see there's a bird box stuck in the middle, and then there's a reservoir at the bottom, and basically the irrigation system happens like a circle, so it circulates through. So it means that they probably don't need topping up, and knowing Scottscape, they've probably utilised rainwater as well. So in areas where water needs to be conserved, they are great. And they've got different types of walls. Some are for wildlife and some are pretty, like this one. But let's go back to ourselves. If you want to have your own living wall, most important thing is to choose your space. It can be any space. It can be deep shade. It can be north facing, south facing. It really doesn't matter. Just the same as any horizontal garden. I would suggest that you obviously put down a waterproof membrane first, and then you attach battens, and then you attach your modules. So you can see here, this little fella here has got his modules. There are many different systems. I think this might be the Plant Box one. I couldn't find out where it came from. So this is a system, what's called a soil-based system. So the plants are put into soil. Sometimes there are, I think Wonderwall does ones where you just put the actual plants in pots and just plonk them in, so you can have seasonal bedding, you know, primroses, and then, you know, geraniums, pelargoniums, whatever. So that's one system. And then this is the other system. So this is the that I touched on briefly. This is the hydroponic hybrid system. So this is the same. It has plant pockets, but it's built of felt. There's a tiny amount of soil in there, and then the pipes run through the line, sort of zigzag all the way through, and then the water just seeps down through the felt. So that's quite a good system. So that's a hydroponic system or a hybrid system. And then once you've done that, you attach the planters to the walls. A big hint, if you are going to do it, plant from the bottom up. I find that's a lot easier. And also bear in mind where they're going to go as well. Watering is obviously key. I remember when I went to college back in God knows when I started my horticultural journey, the first day was spent teaching us about watering. Two types of irrigation system you can have. You can have the ones like you see at pubs, which have these drip pipes, and they come from the tap, and you can put a timer on the tap. But I think if you're in an area where water is at a premium and you want to save water, a circulating system is the best. So you basically have a tank at one end, and the water goes through the pipes. Can you see that it's dripping out there? It slowly but surely seeps its way down through the plants to a drip tray at the bottom, and then goes back to the tank, and round it goes. And that tank can only then needs to be refilled sort of periodically, or it can be again filled by rainwater from your roof. So lots of systems, and that's where the big expenses of living walls is, with the irrigation systems, because there's a lot of pipes, and those pipes can also be used to put through nutrients, and also nematodes for if you want to, because obviously the one thing about living walls is they are a bit prone to vine weevils, so you can push nematodes through there, which will help with pest control. With anything, little and often is best with watering living walls, otherwise they get heavy and waterlogged, and they can't breathe basically. So choosing your plants, I'm guessing this is probably a north facing site because it's got sort of shade tolerant plants in here. Choose the right plant for the right place, as you would for your garden. So here they've got some Ericium at the top, and some Erigerans, and then some Heucherellas, and some ferns. And interesting, I don't know if you'd noticed that the ferns are at the base. The reason being, of course, is because they're in the shade. So the Ericiums are shading the ferns. So always choose the sun-loving plants to go at the top of your wall, and the shade-loving plants at the bottom. And also at the top of your wall, or close to where the irrigation pipes are, choose the plants that like the most water. But the easiest thing to do is to just basically choose plants that like the same soil, water, etc. And then they have the same needs, and you're not having to look after each pocket separately. And make sure you don't overpack them. And then choose what you want to achieve. Do you want it to be smart, snazzy, sculptural one, or do you want it to be wild and untamed, which I would like, or do you want it neat and tidy? So obviously you choose your plants to go with. This is a lady with a herb garden, so you can have herbs growing outside your kitchen window. And even vegetables. This one is inspired by, I think it was Songat, one of the refugee camps. They had living walls growing there, and they just planted their vegetables in Coke bottles and old drain pipes and everything. I mean, it goes to show how clever we are as humans. So here are some living walls. Here's another living wall. This is just basically troughs stuck to a wall. So a very uninteresting, boring garage wall can be made more interesting by adding troughs to it. These particular plants are very good at growing as living walls. So obviously if you want to have the slides, I can let you have those. They do have their challenges. They're expensive, very expensive, unfortunately. They can cost between £200 to £600 a square metre to install. They're also quite difficult to maintain. You can see this fellow here has to abseil to prune his eucharis. So if you are doing your own living wall, make sure you can reach the top of it. Otherwise you won't, you might have to find yourself abseiling to sort it out. I know Scotscape don't push nematodes for their irrigation system. They basically go around with a squeezy bottle and squeeze them into every single pocket. I know, right? But unfortunately, a lot of DIY gardens fail. This is an example of a living wall gone wrong. I think the problem is a lot of people do them with good intentions. They want to look good. This is probably a developer that stuck this living wall on to get planning permission, but actually didn't bother to put a maintenance project to go with it. So make sure it's well maintained. Could have been any reason why this died. Wrong irrigation, the wrong potting mix, vine weevil could have ripped through it. A lot of people choose heucheras because they think they look great on living walls because of the structure of the leaves, but actually they're a nightmare because they do attract vine weevils. And as I said, the wrong plant choice. Lots of people, there are detractors. I remember when I had my Viva, I was given a really hard time by the tutors. They thought that they were a ridiculous show-off waste of time. They actually said, oh, what about even companies putting up, is it called greenwashing? I don't know if you've heard the term greenwashing. It's basically when large companies present themselves as sort of caring environmental ambassadors, when in reality they're quite the opposite. So if they're doing something horrible, we stick a green wall up and everything's all right. So you have to be careful when you're doing a living wall that you're doing it for the right reasons. You're not doing it for show, you are doing it correctly, and that you're going to maintain this living wall and look after it. It is a responsibility. One of the detractors I read about was like, when I had my Viva, they said, well, why don't you just plant a tree? Well, obviously, yes, a tree is easier and cheaper to plant, considerably cheaper, but they're not as efficient as a living wall. If you have a living wall, all that square meterage of space in a tiny, narrow space, all the correct plants chosen, these plants will be in leaf 365 days a year. With trees, they are not, you know, they're only effective for 6 months of the year. Evergreens don't have the same ability for absorbing pollution. Trees can also damage cars with their falling branches, with their sap, with their leaves. This is a picture from Sheffield. I don't know if you remember that terrible thing that happened 2 years ago with Sheffield Council ripping up trees wholesale. The roots were apparently causing damage to pavements and people were tripping up on them. So you could utilise those living pillars instead of trees. So there are, as far as I'm concerned, living walls, although considerably more expensive, are far more effective than trees. So to conclude, so we all know they have the potential to save energy. They reduce heat in the streets, they absorb pollution, they attract beneficial species, they feed our innate biophilic love of greenery. But they are a relatively new phenomenon, and I think time is going to tell. I think people really haven't cottoned onto them yet, and I think they are yet to have their magic moment. And as far as I'm concerned, every wall should be covered with a living wall. And I think the more they are out there, the more companies that are in competition, the cheaper they'll be. I think the government should do green initiatives. I think that would be a very exciting thing, and hopefully one day we will become like Singapore and be like a garden city.